Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to our 8th Zoom talk, Monday night Zoom talk. Thanks for joining us to hear from Ella Factor, who is a union organiser from Queensland. And Ella came down to our conference to be on the union panel with two other excellent union folks, Peter Ong and Tony Mayer. And that recording is available. If you haven't seen it, it's on the Sustainable Prosperity Videos website. It was also in an email that I sent out a couple of days ago with the invite for tonight. So you can go back and watch that again if you'd like to. It was a fantastic session. So thank you, Ella, for agreeing to speak to us tonight. Before we kick off, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're meeting tonight on Aboriginal land. Most of us are on the land of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. If you know that the land that you're on and it's not the Kaurna land, if you'd like to put it in the chat as an acknowledgement, that'd be lovely. I'd also like to acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play in the movement for climate justice, and that this land that we're on has never been ceded, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And with that, I will hand over to Ella. Thank you, Ella.
Thanks, Gabby, and thanks everyone. It's great to be here. Great to come and have a chat with you all about how we can work together to make a better world, I guess is the way I'm seeing it. So before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge that, yes, we are meeting on Aboriginal land, and I pay my respects to the Yugara people where I am attending the meeting from today, and acknowledge that the first Australians as the traditional custodians of this continent, whose cultures are amongst the oldest living cultures in human history. So I thought, so Gabby asked me to come and speak a little bit about how we can work together as an environment movement and the union movement and workers more generally in our fight for climate justice. And so I don't know, I've gone back and forth on how to come at this, reflecting on, I'm in the middle of doing the Centre for Australian Progress National Fellowship at the moment, and one of the guest teachers we had told us that in order to build a shared strategy across the climate justice campaign she was building, they brought volunteers together for 17 days training to be able to build a shared strategy. So just acknowledging that, you know, there's a lot, you can go very deep. But so where to start with? I thought I'd just start with telling you a little bit myself and how I came to the work I've been doing more recently, and some of the realizations I've had along the way and along that journey. So look, I grew up moving between different worlds a lot. Different communities within Australia, each of which had really different norms and understandings of the world in which of Australia. So I started life as a baby of the Aquarius Festival in Nimbin and living in hippie communes around that area, and moving between that and inner city sort of hippie houses full of bohemians, artists, musicians, rebels against the mainstream. And look, the values I learned in that area were very mixed, really. So the environment was always upheld as a sacred wilderness, and humans were seen more as a plague on the environment. There was a utopian view of the human potential to live in peaceful anarchy, not needing governments or rules or anything like that, and that humans are able to live together like that. But there was also the opposite, juxtaposing a view of humans as brainwashed sheep and, you know, selfish and greedy and that sort of thing. Nobody I knew worked for the man, as it were, so nobody was involved in unions. Nobody even told me unions existed in my younger childhood. But we moved a lot between country and city, a lot. I went to 13 schools. And I learnt different things in each of those areas because I went into my friends' homes, you know, got to know the locals in many sort of country towns and that sort of thing. And it's here that I learned that we really rely on the environment for our survival. You know, the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe, you know, this is all from the environment. So I also learned that droughts devastate communities. I learned that long-term unemployment has really widespread impacts on the whole community, not just the person that is long-term unemployed. I learned that stable jobs give freedom, the freedom to commit volunteer hours to your local sports club, to be able to help the kids grow up learning sport, that stable jobs create so much more for the wider community, whereas insecure, low-paid work fosters depression, isolation, hopelessness, destroys social cohesion. I learned the depths of these problems even more when I then found myself living on the streets as a street kid from age 15 onwards for about 3 years. And in that I learned that the mainstream world was very alien to those of us who were on the periphery, and it didn't seem to give a stuff about those of us on the periphery. So skipping forward a few years, I get to adulthood, I go to uni, do my first uni degree, I did social analysis. And that was because I had learned so much about the problems and how deeply the impacts are on people that aren't those holding the wealth and power. But at the other end of the hall, so I was doing social analysis at a brand new faculty that we were the first year of students coming through. Until that year, that campus had been Hawkesbury Agricultural College. It had just suddenly become a place that inner city people went and studied arts, juxtaposed on one campus, and there was a lot of fights between them, let me tell you. But at the other end of the hall from us was the Greenies, what we called them. So, you know, we didn't disrespect any of it, but I was there to study social justice, and they were very focused on environmental issues, and they talked a lot about global warming and peak oil and these sorts of things that seemed incredibly abstract to me at the time. I didn't disagree with them. I was just more worried about the Australians that are being treated as excess to our nation and how that's destroying lives in the immediate. I very quickly ended up in poverty again though, because I then became a single mum. So I moved back up to live amongst the hippies in Byron Shire. But when I got there, I then realised that the wealth inequalities in this community were also very severe. The single mums were working as nannies and cleaners for the trust fund tree changers, basically, the cultural elites that came in and bought the big fancy mansions and set up yoga studios and so forth. And those cultural elites still were pushing this narrative that the environment is a wilderness and humans are a plague. And so it still seemed to be two very differing points of view. I soon moved again because there was no decent work up there. So I moved to the city, I moved to Melbourne looking for better work, which is why I was in Melbourne when Black Saturday hit. And look, I didn't have a good job. I didn't have enough money to be able to afford air conditioning or a rental place with air conditioning, let alone the electricity bills to pay for that. But I'd always thought of air conditioning as a luxury for rich people, you know. But that day was so incredibly hot. Like, it was so much hotter than anything I could have ever imagined before. It was hotter than working in the desert in Israel in the height of summer. It was hotter than any of the other bushfires that I'd lived around or escaped from in my childhood growing up in the bush. I realised climate change was here and the impacts were already hitting us. And it was way hotter than is healthy for people. So, you know, that's, I guess, when I really realised that climate action is a social justice issue. It's not just about protecting the environment as a wilderness separate from humans. So a couple of years after that, I moved back to Sydney and started my Masters in Public Policy, which I think is on my bio that I've done. I did that because I wanted to find a way to do work that was meaningful, that was getting to do, you know, my passion to make a better world, but could also, you know, pay the rent, keep a roof over mine and my son's head. So I changed a lot of my views doing that. I really did. Until, you know, when I started the degree, I was a fan of the Greens Party, and I didn't really understand why poor people, I guess, weren't also voting for climate action in many ways. But I also, look, I studied in that degree, I studied a lot about political psychology, about how public policy change actually happens, how the public can influence change. I went right depth into the theories of mobilising versus organising, and how you build social movements to create change big enough and strong enough that it lasts, that it actually beds itself down into society's norms. So I ended up doing a higher degree research thesis into exactly that. How can the public that cares about the environment influence and make change to what the government's implementing and what the society is accepting. And through that, I developed a new theory of change, and this is still my theory of change now. And part of it was understanding that knowing what your theory of change is core to being able to create that change. So my theory of change became that I think as a majoritarian democracy, and I very much came to realize that I very much believe in majoritarian democracy, that it's better to bring the majority along on the vision, and that's how you bed down social change long term, and that having a meritocracy or a smaller group of elites trying to impose a better world doesn't actually work. So it was from that I realized I believe we need to have a majoritarian government that believes in climate justice and starts implementing it. So that's when I decided to join the Labor Party. So this is still before I got involved in unions. I joined the Labor Party and got involved in organising within the Labor Party to change their policies. But part of, like, what is really key here, one of the realizations I'd had was that the term climate action is an empty term. It doesn't convey values of social justice. That was when I started studying climate justice and how the meeting of social justice and climate action actually, works a lot better. So I realized that advocating for just climate action alone doesn't actually suit my values. I'm an advocate for climate justice. I realized this from some things, from learning that on that Black Saturday that had been so hot in Melbourne that day, I learned that more people in Victoria died that day from the heat than from the famous firestorms that happened. It was because they didn't have access to air conditioning. I started thinking, wait, does this mean access to air conditioning is becoming a human right? Does this mean governments have a responsibility for looking at who has access to air conditioning? That it's not just a luxury for rich people like I'd always thought? Does that mean that electricity supply itself is a human right that as a social justice advocate, I have to be advocating for? That's when I started thinking about what I'd seen climate action activists supporting in the past. And I realized that a lot of the climate action policies that were being promoted at that time were things like subsidizing homeowners to get insulation and to get solar PV on their roofs. But renters didn't get either of those things. I learned about the electricity network death spiral, which is when more and more people with wealth go self-sufficient, disconnect from the grid, and therefore the fixed costs of the electricity grid get put more and more on a shrinking pool of customers. And of course, who's that shrinking pool of customers? It's the renters that aren't being subsidised to put solar PV on their roofs because they don't own their roofs. I saw that electricity costs just kept increasing for renters, and that the bills were skyrocketing. For me as well, I was a single mum struggling to pay the bills and getting to the point where it's eating into the food budget, the rent budget, all of these things. And then moving to Canberra completely blew all budgets out of the water because energy costs in Canberra are insanely high if you live in an old rental house with no insulation or solar PV. So that's when I decided to join Labor and got busy organising for change. But inside Labor, I quickly discovered that there was that same dichotomy going on amongst the environmentalists. Now, let me tell you that a lot of people in Labor are environmentalists, self-identify as environmentalists, and joined the Labor Party due to environmental issues. Huge amount of the current cohort of the Labor Party elite joined back in the fight against nuclear in the 80s, for example. So what I realised that there was still that split between those that said you have to advocate for jobs as the most important thing to get people out of poverty, and then those that say that you have to advocate to protect the environment from human industry. And so I joined LEAN, the Labour Environment Action Network, and our mission became the education of the people that make up the Labour Party to explain that this false dichotomy must be rejected. It's destroying our ability to fight for justice. It's destroying our ability to ever win, let alone create a movement big enough to get a majoritarian movement for change. So we have to get rid of that false dichotomy, and we have to instead explain to everybody that cares, because most of the people that are in this because they do care, that the most powerful way forward is actually to look after people and the environment. because people need country and country needs people. They exist together. But my understanding of all of this was still way too theoretical. I was still just coming out of doing a thesis and it was all academic. So I still needed to get out there and talk to the people on the front line. I needed to get out there and talk to unions. And one of my questions that I started with, and this is back again, this is 2013, 2014, this was happening. I went to the unions to ask why they opposed to the RET, the renewable energy target. And I very quickly learned from going and speaking to the unions of the workers involved that that transition was treating workers terribly, that it was replacing secure, well-paid jobs with companies, multinational companies coming in, mostly American, that had very anti-union beliefs, that were setting up greenfields projects where they locked unions out completely and they staffed them with low-paid labour hire workers for short-term jobs that would end instantly. No wonder the workers were seeing this competition come in and not wanting to be part of voting to give up their jobs or their hope of the future. So that's when I sort of realized that both the small scale renewable energy transition and the large scale renewable energy transition were both problematic. The small scale was about subsidizing property owners, those with wealth, at the expense of renters. The large scale transition was all about subsidizing international corporations at the expense of workers and at the expense of everybody's electricity prices because they kept going up. So that's when I realized how badly that we as the environmental movement that I had seen so much as my identity for my whole life, that's when I realized that we were failing the most vulnerable, we were failing the frontline communities, that those most negatively impacted by the social structures that created climate change were also being the most negatively impacted by so much of the policies that were being proposed for the transition. So that's how I got to the point of what I do now is try to seek out shared values of all these different worlds and help build a shared vision, a vision where we can work towards both jobs and the environment, where frontline communities get to have their say over designing the pathways for their community to reach a sustainable, prosperous future, where we all back each other in, where we find ways to achieve multiple goals with good policy and good communication, and at its core, with empathy. Empathy for each other instead of judgment, and particularly instead of class snobbery, which I think is a large part of the clashes of these narratives. So that brings me to a really foundational issue that our whole movement has, on both sides, I'd say our whole society has, is assumptions, blind assumptions. For example, if groups of people, if groups of voters, if they assume, if they believe that any policy we propose would inflict the bads disproportionately on them and would give the goods of the policy disproportionately to somebody else, even if that's not actually your intent, if they think that's your intent, they're going to fight you. They're not going to support you. So I went to Townsville last year for 6 weeks leading up to the election. So today is the anniversary of my last day in Townsville last year. Not a great day. But voters in northern Queensland did not understand that the vegan farm raids were a different group than the Stop Adani convoy. They didn't know there was a difference. They certainly did not know that any of the activists in that Stop Adani convoy believed to themselves that they cared about the well-being of regional Queenslanders. They had assumptions about the Stop Adani convoy, just as the people that designed the Stop Adani convoy based it on their assumptions about what would work for voters in Australia. The regional Queenslanders I spoke to, they thought that the Stop Adani convoy had absolutely nothing to do with protecting the environment. They told me that repeatedly. They thought it was just a bunch of inner city post-materialists showing massive class snobbery and hypocrisy and complete disrespect for the communities that they were invading, let alone for those communities' self-identity as what they contribute to Australian life. So on the other hand, we saw many enviro activists, and not all, but many, and enough that the narrative is widely believed by so many of the voters in the regions, that the enviro activists dismiss regional voters as stupid, as uneducated, as selfish for wanting to keep their dirty jobs instead of being willing to give them up and move to jobs in tourism instead. People in those regions that do have the tourism jobs, they know that tourism jobs are low paid and insecure jobs. They're not enough to continue to supporting a family on. If you've worked your way up through this dirty, hard-working job with your risk of black lung and everything, and you've worked your way up to $100,000 a year job, and you're supporting your whole extended family on that money, going for a casual barista job does not seem like a valid replacement job. So there's assumptions on both sides. And, you know, one thing I have been known to say to inner city environmental activists is, unless you're willing to give up your income and your wealth and drop to a barista wage, you don't have a right to tell anybody else they have to do that. So, assumptions. Think about it in this way, maybe. If somebody doesn't agree with you, if you're trying to explain something and they don't agree with you, what do you assume is the reason why they're not agreeing? Do you assume that they don't share your values? So that's the opposition is evil intent kind of assumption? Or do you assume that they don't agree with you because they're too stupid or not educated enough, or they just don't understand? Or do you try to see the world from their point of view to try to gain an understanding of why they don't agree with you that isn't based on a judgmental assumption? So campaign strategy. So this is what I do. I write campaigns and I help train up volunteers to work on those campaigns. Campaign strategy generally starts with what's called power mapping. You get out a big whiteboard usually, and you draw a map of who is your opposition and who are your supporters. And of the opposition, are they very powerful or very weak in power? Of your supporters, are they very powerful or very weak in power? The reason you do that is because you're making decisions about what you're going to try to strategically achieve in your campaign. Are you going to try to amplify the power of those that support you that are low in power to bring them up to the sweet spot, which is powerful and supportive of you? Are you going to try to take the powerful opposition and reduce their power to make them weak? Or another option is, are you going to try to take your powerful opposition and move them towards supporting you so they keep their power levels and move to that sweet spot of being powerful and supporting you? Whenever you're making decisions in where you're going to try to move people on this power map, you're giving up. There's opportunity cost. If you try to move them, if you try, for example, to move the people that you see as opposing you, you try to weaken their power, you've given up any opportunity of moving closer to supporting you. So sometimes if they're really locked in on being opposition to you, it's the only way to go, is to reduce their power. But you have to remember, every time you're making that decision, it's a strategic decision where the other opportunity is to try to move them closer to you. And that all comes down to assumptions. You're making those decisions based on the assumptions. So in order to make that kind of campaign strategy decision, you need to do strategic research. You need to really try to step into the shoes of the people that you believe are your opposition to try to understand if there's any opportunity of moving them over to the sweet spot. And that, coming back to the ideal of the majoritarian, the major movement where it gets bedded down into social norms as what we all believe we need to achieve, that happens when you're moving people over to agreeing with you. It doesn't happen when you're sacrificing any opportunity to move them over to agreeing with you. And that's just basic campaign strategy that you apply to any campaign you're trying to run. Okay, so remembering that big social movements only happen when we move our goals closer together. And whenever we're not doing that, whenever we're trying to reduce each other's power, what we're doing is splitting and fragmenting. So if you've got other people that are vaguely on anywhere similar side, if you can find shared values, if you can find shared goals, it's going to be more powerful to move more people to that sweet spot of the power map than it ever is to decide based on unexamined assumptions that it's impossible to move them closer and therefore the only thing to do is to reduce their power. I hope that makes sense. I just thought, you know, back to that 17 days of campaign strategy training, there's 10 minutes of it. So from that, what I've understood is that we need to find the values we share. That's the way to move forward, to build a wider movement, is to focus, instead of focusing on the differences, it's to focus on what values do we share, what vision for the future could we build together. And there's plenty of values we share, there's heaps. And there's some values that our side of the movement has that are based on class snobbery, and we need to jettison them. So, for example, we all want a better future for our kids. We all want a better future for the next generation. There's very few humans that don't want that. That value is aspirational at its core. So we need to therefore respect why working class communities value aspiration. We all want to take pride in our contributions. Everybody wants to take pride in our contributions. We all contribute in a different way, and we want to be able to take pride in that. So therefore, we need to respect why people working in those dirty, smelly, exhausting jobs, why do they take pride in those jobs? Well, for example, they take pride, great pride, that they're in a community that has for generations kept Australia's lights on. And they see themselves as really being a core, you know, the engine house of the Australian economy. And they take pride in that, and we need to respect that, not judge. So door knocking in Townsville last year taught me many, many things. Another one that it taught me is a big reminder, which I should have known because I grew up half in the country myself. Country folk love the country. They spend a lot more time in nature than city folk do. They're in national parks almost, if not every day, at least every weekend for their leisure. But they all have to make their priorities. And if you're worried about keeping food on the table for your children, you won't vote to give up your job for an abstract, collective, global, long-term goal. If that goal does not seem to be connected to your real world that you're living in, you're not going to vote to give up your job for it. It's just common sense. So voting to keep your polluting job doesn't actually make you evil. It just means that you've been given really bad options to choose between. So the problem there is the options being given to those voters, not the voters themselves for choosing between what they perceive those options to be. So back to social justice, a really core principle of social justice is always to listen to the voices of those directly impacted. Have respect for their earned wisdom, even if it doesn't match your academic beliefs. So what I realized is if I want to make a change to the industry, which I want to make big changes to the electricity industry in this country, I have to think about the workers as being one of the frontline communities, a frontline community of that industry. Another key principle is that the directly impacted are best placed to design the solution. So I realized if you want to make change, what you need to do is go and talk to the unions and ask them, listen to their ideas, listen to what the real problems are. They're at the coalface of it, literally. So if you want to know how to construct a better renewable energy base and a better transition to a renewable energy base, ask the workers. Ask the ETU, the Electrical Trade Union, the Construction Union, the Manufacturing Workers Union, all the people that work in this space. They understand the needs a hell of a lot better than a lawyer from the city does. So another example is when on a different policy, I wanted to advocate on policy about bad construction quality in my city. In Canberra, it was all over the news. The voters were really arcing out that there was terrible construction quality going on. So I went to the CFMEU and I asked them instead of just making up a policy myself. And lo and behold, they'd already developed one. So all I needed to do was advocate for it, help elevate their voices more in the Labor Party. So thinking about it, what are unions? They're actually collectives of workers, yeah? They're formed for the benefit of their members. Many unions do recognise that social justice, wider social justice issues directly impact or indirectly impact their members, so they advocate on them. But no union is going to advocate to throw their own workers under the bus. And they shouldn't. That wouldn't be ethical for them. That they're elected with responsibilities to represent their members. And we shouldn't be expecting any one group of workers to be martyrs for the rest of us to be able to make a transition. We need to make sure it's a just transition that leaves no one behind. But we also need to recognise that unions are facing the same structural challenges that created climate change. and created the problems and the reasons why we haven't addressed climate change. So if the environment movement wants to meet them where they're fighting, then we need to put the time and effort into analysing any policy proposals that we put up to make sure that they don't have a potential unintended consequence of disproportional negative impacts on the poor, on the people on the periphery, on the people in the regions, on the people that already have, before COVID hit, nearly 30% youth unemployment, where there's no hope for the next generation. Instead, we need to build a vision that makes sure that they get to have a say over designing a prosperous, sustainable future. And together, if we build on those shared values and build a shared vision, then the movement can work collectively. To do this, it requires the humility to admit where we've gone wrong in the past, the willingness to see things from other people's point of view without getting defensive. It means self-reflexivity. Years ago, my thesis supervisor, David Schlossberg, so if anybody's interested in looking up more about the environmental justice movement, he is one of the leading academics in the world on it. I really recommend you looking up his work, David Schlossberg. He told me that the most important thing of all is self-reflexivity. To be an effective activist, that's the foundation. So that's my conclusion, that for anyone that wants to know how the environment movement can do better at working with unions, this is where we have to start. We need to listen to each other. We need to have respect for each other. We need to self-reflect on what our own contribution it is. And only by doing that can we build a shared collective vision for jobs and the environment. Oh, and just never be a neoliberal or a post-materialist while people in this country can't afford to feed their children. Alrighty, that's me. Any questions?
Thank you. I might unmute everybody and we'll give you a round of applause. Let me see if I can do it. Unmute, unmute. There we go. Thank you.
Say, I could see the chat was going crazy, but I kept it minimised.
So Ella, sorry, I just muted you as well, but now you're back. Thank you. That was a lot to take in. I know I'll be wanting to go and listen back to that again just to get my head around everything. And thank you for suggesting David Schlossberg. Could you, if you've got time, could you type that into the chat so I get the spelling of the last name right? That would be super helpful, and I will look it up and send it round. There was a question that was sent through to me from Paul, and it was about collaboration. So I guess like taking the next step after understanding or alongside understanding, you know, what is real collaboration start? How can we start that? What does it look like? How can we collaborate with workers and their industrial reps to, well, create sustainable jobs and transition away from fossil fuels? Ah, amazing, thank you.
There's a link to his profile. Sorry, that was just a question and I was busy grabbing a link to his profile.
Yeah, just a question about collaboration.
Yeah.
How would we go about that? So working with the union movement, working with workers.
So, as I said, the first thing is always to start with actually looking at, like, doing that strategic research. So most unions, while the union leaders are usually incredibly busy and focused on industrial, most unions do have policy officers and they do put out statements and give speeches and that sort of thing. So I would always start with whichever union you're wanting to look at, look up what they've already been saying on the issue. A great example is, you know, Tony Mayer, who was the other guest speaker in the panel back at the January conference. He's been writing on just transition for about 15 years. He's made many speeches on it, that sort of thing. I've heard a lot of people just assume that the entire CFMEU are on the side of evil kind of thing. And that's only possible to assume that if you've not looked at any of the work that they've put out publicly where they've actually been advocating for a just transition. The ACTU, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, they also have policy offices, and they have an entire Just Transitions group within them. They held a Just Transitions conference back in 2016, which was fantastic. They brought a bunch of German unionists over to explain to us how Germany had designed that the redundancy retirement redeployment scheme, which was how they had done a rapid transition there. So they brought them all out in 2016, and it's all available on the ACTU website, which unions were involved, most of them, and that sort of thing. So the first step to collaborating with unions is to see them and look at them as they are putting themselves out, rather than as how the media is describing them. Core thing to remember is the media don't like unions, so you're always going to get a very negative and not always very accurate description. Next step is to reach out to them directly. Ring them up, their phone number's on the web. That's how I did it. I rang up the CFMEU and got a meeting with the local state. So for example, the CFMEU, here's an example of the complexity, okay? They are not one union, they're a super union, which means that they're a federation of a lot of unions. So in every state, they are run as their own kingdom. So the construction union in Victoria has its own secretary, and the construction union federally has a secretary, and the mining union has a separate secretary, okay? So don't assume that the construction union is the mining union. They're not. They're just part of the same super union, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know more about, gaining support for doing renewable energy building in the way of doing it as a just transition. I went to the construction union. They explained to me how they would love to have a real just transition policy. It would be wonderful for their members, but how bad the RET was actually treating them. I went to the ETU, the Electrical Trades Union. Again, I just rang them up and said, I'm a climate activist. I want to understand what your point of view is so that I can work with you instead of against you. That's how I opened it. And they very happily gave me those meetings. And I went to those meetings with questions and listened. I didn't go in to preach to them about why they're wrong and why they should support climate action.
Yeah.
Asked them why they had reservations about it, given they care as much about the future as I do. And that's how I learned what the problems were. And once I learned the problems, I stopped supporting that policy too. I went back to Labor and went, you know what, this policy is terrible. It's doing really bad things to the workers. We shouldn't do it this way. That was when I developed my next big campaign, which was the public renewables, that renewables should be built, owned and operated by the government, which, by the way, I ended up, because of those meetings with ETU, I went to the ETU policy officer. I said, I've got an idea for a campaign. It's a public renewables campaign. I want to do it nationally, but it's too big. I think I should start in Queensland because Queensland hasn't privatised their electricity yet. And I sat down with them and I listened to what their concerns was, and we built that campaign together. We didn't just do it as activists. We also fundraised, and we got John Quiggin to do our modelling for us. We got Essential to do our narrative testing, focus groups, etc. for us. And then we ran a joint campaign with the ETU to Queensland Labor to build, own and operate public renewables. And we won because because the CFMU came on board as well, and the manufacturing union came on board as well. As soon as they heard that I was advocating for clean, cheap electricity and energy supply to build smart future manufacturing, they came on board as well. I ended up very quickly having all the unions coming on board and lobbying Queensland Labor. And the slogan was, don't privatise our electricity by stealth, because they were about to go down the same path the other states had done of aiming for their renewables by contracting it out to private companies. And so now Queensland has got Australia's first publicly owned clean energy corporation, and they're building publicly owned renewables. And it's because I listened to the unions and worked with them.
Well, we need like hundreds more of you, I think. If not thousands.
Do it.
Yeah. From the outside, you often get the sense that the union movement is quite impenetrable, because they do have this really highly developed structure, and you need to go to the right person, and but that shouldn't be stopping us, I think.
No, because as I said, every union has at least a receptionist, like just a public phone number on it. If you ring that and say, who's the right person for me to speak to, they'll transfer.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is, like, a lot of unions are absolutely run off their feet with JobKeeper and JobSeeker and trying to look after their members and welcoming new members and all of that sort of thing. But hopefully, you know, over the coming, you know, couple of months, maybe things will settle down a bit, fingers crossed again, and it might be time to start talking to them about, you know, what they want to see in terms of people's recovery.
I'd say many of the unions are busily working on this. I've seen more activity happen since everybody's stuck at home than in a long time. Look, that's always a rule, that the union leaders in particular are always ridiculously busy.
Yeah.
If you want to work with them, you have to do it on their timeline. Never try to impose another one, because it just won't happen. And because their priority is the industrial interests of their members, that's what they're elected to do. But like I said, most of them do have policy officers. Some have a whole policy team. CPSU, because, you know, we're public service union, of course, we have a whole policy team. But all the others, and then even just if you can't find the right union, you can always go to the ACTU. Now, something to remember is the ACTU can't decide a policy position for the union movement. They don't have that authority. That's not who they are, but they can help you guide and connect you to the policy officers they've got that are working with all the unions to develop a policy position, or to the policy officers of each union.
We have, I don't know if you've seen on Facebook, probably not, because there's so much on there, but we've organised for a small print run of Stephanie Kelton's book to happen. So we've pulled our resources, and we're going to get a bunch of copies of that book, and we would like to distribute that amongst people who would like to read it, especially in the union movement. I think that would be great. Again, we don't want to go and say, you must read this book, this is you know, this is the key to everything. It'd be much more of, hopefully, a conversation and an invitation to read a book like what Stephanie has written, which is probably going to have a pretty big impact. Well, hopefully, again, we'll have a pretty big impact both here and overseas.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great method. We, as in LEAN, that's the Labour Environment Action Network, we did a similar thing with Jeremy Rivkin's book, The Green New Deal. We got an entire run and we gave it out to all the MPs and union leaders.
Wonderful. Oh, well, good. We're on the right track with that then. That's good to hear. Excellent.
And I've gotten great feedback, and a lot of people saying that it's blown their mind. So
yeah, amazing. I'll just scroll back through the chat and see if there's a bit of thought, sort of discussion here. Just wondering if there's any questions.
How can we pressure the leaders of the ALP to be more proactive?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, I do it democratically through massive numbers is my way. What I've found is there's many different pathways to change policy in the Labor Party. Technically, you could do it by going as a member to one branch and passing a motion, and it could make its way up and get passed at conference. Technically, you could convince one MP to love your idea and become a policy champion of that idea and run around and do it. But in the end, the only way that change really happens in the Labor Party, it's called doing the numbers. So it's about having exactly the same as it is in the wider democracy, a really large policy public that wants that change to happen. And that's what the leaders follow, whether you're talking the wider democracy of Australia or the smaller but just as messy democracy of inside the Labor Party. So while you could get, like, just keep lobbying one or two MPs and win them over, what you're doing then is you're asking them to be the person that goes around and lobbies everybody else in the Labor Party. So you're putting a lot of trust and a lot of responsibility on an MP when you don't need to. I do it myself. So that's what Lean does. Lean is all about mass branch campaigning. Labor Party has a branch or sub-branch, they're called in different states. In every suburban town in this country, there's Labor Party members that meet to discuss policy and pass motions. The way Lean does it is train up volunteers to do a presentation and explain, using the jobs and the environment together narrative, because that's the core Labor values narrative. We explain that we're advocating for climate justice, which is climate action with Labor values, and we go out to every branch that will have us. So out of roughly 800 branches across the country, our last campaign got 570 branches to pass the motion. By the time and them all to email the leaders of the party saying they'd passed the motion. So their emails are completely filling up from across the country that they've got mass support for it.
Yeah. So I guess
one had to, but they can't back down if they've got that larger policy public.
I guess a group like ours is, you know, we don't have that capacity, but we can have conversations on a smaller scale and kind of make sure that we're aligned with what Lean are talking about, and that way we can sort of like work together rather than at cross purposes.
That's a really big part of it. And, you know, again, I keep coming back to empathy and respect for values, because people, you know, tribalism is a little bit normal. If you're worried that the person coming and trying to get you to change your mind doesn't share your values, you're not as likely to listen to them. And that's really true in the Labor Party. If they're worried that you're actually some kind of tree Tory that doesn't actually share the Labor values bit, they won't listen.
Yeah.
But if you convince them that you're here with the same values of, you know, they're basically social democratic values, the value statements on the website, if you want to check. If you come at them with that, then that takes down some of those barriers. So it's all about popping down, like reducing the barriers to collaboration by showing that you have empathy and respect, and then they'll show the same back.
Yeah. I think, you know, there's many of us here that would identify as, say, members of Get Up, members of perhaps Extinction Rebellion, members of Stop Adani. I know I would say, yes, I'm affiliated with all of those movements. Is that going to be something that means that we are not welcome?
Not at all. Many Labor Party members are members of all of those things. It comes, again, if you're doing it because you want to make a better world, there's going to be respect for that, as long as you're not bringing class snobbery along with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, there's heaps of, most people join the Labor Party because they're already activists. Something else from campaign strategy theory in general is every movement has lots of different roles in it. There's a need for every different kind of role. There's a need for the rebels. There's a need for the inside track people. There's a need for the researchers. There's a need for the community organisers. You can't have a really strong, large movement without all of those roles. The trick is that those roles need to not be fighting against each other and putting each other down for not doing the same role they are, but to recognise that we're all working together in different ways to try to achieve the same vision. So for the Labor Party, the way it's usually spoken of is it's called the light on the hill. We all share that light on the hill. We're all going to take a different path to get there. But as long as you're not turning around and shoving other people back down or saying your path's not good enough, I'm going to, you know, put obstacles in your way to get to the light on the hill because I'm going to get there faster. Or another analogy I heard a couple of years ago, which I thought was wonderful, is if you're really able-bodied and privileged and able to run up that hill to the top really easily, that doesn't mean you're a better person than somebody else that's being a community organiser that's down there right at the back with the people struggling up the hill and helping them come up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so running to the top of the hill and throwing rocks down at the people that are only halfway down the hill because they're not at the top with you yet isn't helping. It's fracturing the movement further.
Do we have time to delve a little bit into the fraught relationship between Labor and the Greens, or is that going to take another hour?
I can give you a book recommendation.
Okay.
There's a book called Whitlam's Children. It's a friend's PhD thesis that was so good he got it published.
Yeah.
And it literally traces the history of both. And in the end, the conclusion of it is that to at least 90% or so, Labor people and Greens people share the same policy values. The difference between the two is the theory of change. You know how I was talking earlier, I made really clear earlier what my theory of change is? Yep. That's another core part of campaign strategy, is to understand not just what you're trying to achieve, but how you're trying to achieve it. So you work out a theory of change of, I'm going to make this happen so that this will happen. It's important because of this, yeah? So yep. Mine is, and leans generally, is change Labor to change Australia to change the world. So you've got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's because the Labor theory of change is to form government. Greens have a different theory of change. They're not trying to form majority government.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the biggest difference between the two. And most of the fights between the two are over that, are over calling Labor not pure enough because they're trying to represent a much wider amount of voices on the one side, or calling them too pure because they, you know, like they have a different theory of change. I can't explain to you the Greens theory of change because I don't share it. It's very hard to explain a theory of change you don't share. So I do share the belief that we need to form government. I'm a social democrat. I believe that there is a really strong role for the public sector, for the public as a good, to provide public services, including a just transition.
Yeah. I think, I know, and we've got to wrap it up pretty soon, but I think from my point of view, like the majority have been dragged to the right over like 30 years of neoliberalism, so that what is where the centre is actually artificially kind of pushed over to the right of where we would imagine it is.
To most voters, that's a very abstract concept. Most voters don't have an understanding of what left and right really means. They do understand values though. So when I went out door knocking in Townsville and I said, what we need is the government to invest in giving us cheaper, cleaner, more reliable energy and better TAFE and investment in building an advanced manufacturing industry so we can have enough exports for this region to replace coal if the world stops buying coal, they all 100% agreed with that. Coal miners were 100% on board with that. So because I went, what's your shared values? Instead of looking for what the difference is and why there's problems about the difference, I look for what's shared.
Cool. Yes, good answer, good wrapping up. Steve, Brian said, as someone who was involved in setting up the SA Greens, it's not true that the Greens didn't want to form government.
Yeah, that's why I said I can't explain to you the Greens theory of change. I find it's mixed.
Yeah. I think what kind of kicks people in the guts too is that the knowledge that we don't have much time. And that's a really
absolutely. And that's why it's so important that we work together. We don't have time. We cannot waste another decade bickering.
Yeah.
If it requires some compromise to get to some bipartisan policy that we can then strengthen, that's better than nothing. We do not have time to waste.
Yeah. Thank you. And
we don't have time to keep losing elections to the Tories.
We don't. And yeah, we need to come up with some light on the hill, shared light on the hill. That's what I would like to see. Meg's waving at me. Do you have a question, Meg? Do you want to unmute?
Yep. Yes. So Ella, I just have a question about the just transition. So on the skills of the workers currently in the mining and fossil fuel industries, how many of the workers have skills that are immediately transferable? What's the need for retraining and investment in new industries that are going to absorb those workers?
Desperate need for training and investment in industry. That's the most urgent thing. You know, if you look after the unemployment, everything else will follow, right? So if you build the jobs for the future that are in clean energy, then the workers will go to them. But if you just tell the workers they have to give up their jobs without building the alternative, they won't. And it can't be little piecemeal. There's so much work done on how to do these schemes by the unions. The unions have so much knowledge on what's wrong with the current just transition policy proposals and how to do them better. Some unions already do a whole bunch of things like training and job placement in areas where they can. This is the stuff that people that are in non-unionised areas, one of the issues, for example, is that heaps of the workers up there that aren't working for a coal mine, like a big company, have all become tradies. So they're all individual businesses. So they're struggling as well, yeah? So it's got to be a much wider thing than looking at the workers in the coal plants or the workers in the coal mines. You've got to look at what does the whole region need economically to build a sustainable, prosperous future. Put the investment in, do the training, offer the training and the, you know, research and development and the startup money to be able to build it, and the workers will follow.
I've just noticed how you've said often sustainable, prosperous future. And I quite love that, because our group is at the moment tossing up whether we should continue to be called the Just Transition Action Group or the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group. And I have a little poll that I'd like to share with people before you all drop off for the second hour. So I'm just going to put that up on screen. And this is not a binding poll. It's a temperature check, a temperature test. So it's anonymous. So I won't be holding you to this, but please let me know what you think. I'll give you a minute. And when I can see that a lot of people have voted, I'll share it with everybody. Can you actually see the answers? No, you can't see the answers.
But yes, it's a conscious decision of mine, because after speaking to a lot of unions and a lot of workers, I realised that the word transition does not have positive connotations.
Okay, good to know.
Usually when workers are being told that their jobs are going to be transitioning, that's code for they're getting the sack.
And the sustainable prosperity option just ticked up there. Good, I'm loving this. This is great. Okay, I'm gonna stop the poll now. So please vote if you haven't already. Okay, there we go. End poll. Share results. We have a, well, it's close. We have a slight edge. That's good. There will be a proper poll sent around by email to everybody who's on our mailing list, which is probably about 130 people. I don't expect that many will vote, but we'll do a doodle poll and everybody can have a proper vote as soon as I can get that organised. But it's nice to see just what people's thoughts are there. Thank you. Great. Okay. So thank you again, Ella. It's been so good to hear from you, and some of the things that you've said need to sear themselves into our brains. We all need to watch this talk again, I think. I might just stop the recording there, but thank you again so much. It's been great to have you on. I'll stop the recording.